Today is Sunday, July 5th, 2026, and today is National Workaholics Day, which feels a little too personal. Between producing a daily history podcast, narrating audiobooks, and working a full-time job, I'm not entirely sure whether this is a holiday or an intervention. But after digging through today's stories, I noticed that they all had something in common. They're things we rarely stop and think about anymore. A can of meat that's become a cultural icon, the right to vote at 18, and a government agency almost everyone recognizes, for the wrong reason. Sometimes history isn't about the biggest moments. Sometimes it's about the everyday things we simply assume have always been there. Welcome to Wait, That's Random, This Day in History. I'm C.L. Burns, voice actor, audiobook narrator, and a person who keeps discovering that history is somehow both fascinating and deeply concerning at the same time. On July 5th, 1937, Spam went on sale for the very first time. And before anyone writes me an email, yes, I'm talking about the canned meat, not the kind that fills your inbox. Although, both have somehow managed to survive much longer than anyone expected. Spam was introduced by Hormel during the Great Depression. It was inexpensive, it had a long shelf life, and it made good use of cuts of pork that might otherwise have gone wasted. It wasn't glamorous, it was practical. Then World War II arrived. Because Spam could be shipped almost anywhere without refrigeration, it became a staple for Allied troops around the world. Millions of cans were sent overseas. For many soldiers, it wasn't just food. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, sometimes all three. After the war, Spam had become something much larger than a grocery store product. It had become part of popular culture. Today, it's sold in dozens of countries. It's especially popular in places like Hawaii, Guam, South Korea, and the Philippines, where creative local dishes have turned it into a beloved ingredient rather than a punchline. And yes, it also has become the subject of countless jokes. I suppose that's one of the strangest measures of success. When your product has lasted nearly 90 years, inspired songs, comedy sketches, an entire category of unwanted email, and is still sitting on grocery store shelves, you've probably done something right. Of course, some changes affect far more than what's in our pantry. Some change who gets a voice. On July 5th, 1971, the 26th Amendment officially lowered the voting age in the United States from 21 to 18. Today, that feels completely normal. If you're 18, you can vote. Most of us have never known anything different. But for much of American history, that wasn't the case. You could become an adult, work full-time, pay taxes, even serve in the military, but you still couldn't cast a ballot. During the Vietnam War, that contradiction became impossible for many Americans to ignore. Young men could be drafted into combat, sent thousands of miles from home, and risk their lives for decisions made by elected leaders, without having any say in choosing those leaders. A simple phrase captured the argument perfectly. Old enough to fight, old enough to vote. It spread across the country. Lawmakers from both parties agreed something needed to change. Remarkably, the 26th Amendment became one of the fastest constitutional amendments ever ratified. Congress approved it in March. By July, it was part of the Constitution. That's incredibly fast by constitutional standards. I've always thought this story is a good reminder that history isn't only about gaining new rights. Sometimes it's about recognizing that people have already earned them. And our final story proves that sometimes history remembers an organization for something it wasn't originally created to do. On July 5th, 1865, the United States Secret Service was established. If I asked you what the Secret Service does, I'm guessing most people would answer, they protect the president. And today they'd be right. But that's not why the agency was created. In fact, protecting the president wasn't part of its job at all. At the end of the Civil War, the United States had a serious problem. Counterfeit money was everywhere. Some historians estimate that as much as 1/3 of the currency circulating in the country was fake. Imagine that for a moment. You get paid on Friday. You stop at the grocery store. And there's a decent chance the money in your wallet isn't actually worth anything. It wasn't just a nuisance. It threatened the entire economy. So the government created the Secret Service with one mission: find the counterfeiters, protect the nation's money. The timing is another remarkable piece of history. President Abraham Lincoln signed the legislation creating the Secret Service on the very day he was assassinated. Ironically, the agency that many people now associate with presidential protection didn't begin guarding presidents until decades later, after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. Today, the Secret Service still investigates financial crimes while also protecting presidents, vice presidents, visiting world leaders, and their families. I love stories like this because they remind us that institutions evolve. Sometimes the job people become famous for isn't the job they were hired to do. And looking back across today's stories, they all involve ordinary things that quietly became part of everyday life. A canned lunch, the right to vote at 18, an agency whose original purpose most of us have forgotten. Which brings us to someone who understood another everyday truth. People are endlessly curious. Born on July 5, 1810, P.T. Barnum became one of the greatest promoters in American history. Today, many people remember him as the circus man. But that description barely scratches the surface. Barnum understood something fundamental about human nature. People don't simply buy products. They buy curiosity. Long before television, before radio, before social media, Barnum knew how to make people stop what they were doing and ask, "Wait, what is that?" He promoted unusual performers, exhibitions, museums, spectacles. Sometimes they were exactly what he claimed. Sometimes they were enhanced by a healthy dose of showmanship. Whether people admired him or criticized him, one thing was undeniable. Barnum knew how to get attention. And once he had it, he knew how to turn curiosity into a crowd. In a strange way, many of the techniques we see in modern advertising, entertainment, and even social media can trace some of their DNA back to Barnum. Thankfully, most of us have become a little more skeptical. At least, I'd like to think so. And looking back across today's stories, I realize how quickly extraordinary things become ordinary. Spam went from a practical solution during the Great Depression to a food people joke about while still buying millions of cans every year. The right to vote at 18 feels so natural today that it's easy to forget it took a constitutional amendment to make it happen. The Secret Service became so closely associated with protecting presidents that most people never realized it started out chasing counterfeiters. And P.T. Barnum proves something that's still true more than a century later. If you can make people curious, you've already taken the first step toward capturing their attention. Anyway, history has a funny way of turning yesterday's surprises into today's assumptions. The longer something sticks around, the easier it is to forget there was a time before it existed. I'll leave you with a quote from P.T. Barnum himself. "The noblest art is that of making others happy." If you'd like to hear more of my work, narration, podcasts, or other projects, you can find it all at waitthat'srandom.com. I'm C.L. Burns, and thanks for wandering through history with me for a while. I'll see you tomorrow.